Don't worry, I'm not going to sign this entire presentation. But what I will do is use a story of a young child who has parents both are deaf to discover any development delays for the child. In the book, Mother, Father, Deaf by Paul Princeton talks about many different adults who grew up with one or both their parents who are deaf. This leads to the question, how does growing up in a deaf world while being able to hear affect a child's development? Let's take a look, shall we? Before we can get to the ecological perspective of a child, let's talk about why having deaf parents could affect the child. Right off the bat, we can say that if their parents are deaf, then they will probably not speak correctly or at all to the child. In a child's first few months of life, he or she will listen to adults talking to them. They will also watch their parents' mouth, seeing how the mouth forms to make different words. This trains the child's brain to figure out how to form the words for him or herself. When a child isn't talked to, though, the child will lose the chance to listen and watch words being formed, making talking much more difficult for the child. Also, living with parents who are deaf places the child in another community with a different language and a distant culture. This is because many adults who are deaf will tend to socialize with other people who are deaf. As the child grows up, he or she will be surrounded more with people who are deaf than those who can hear. A child can also feel unconnected to the parents. On page 17 in Mother, Father, Deaf, a woman talks about when her daughter was born, she wondered if the child was deaf or could hear. To test this, the woman dropped a spoon on a metal tray 3 times to check. The child ended up responding to the sounds. The mother then worried if her child would feel separate from her husband and herself. Now let's take an actual case. In the book, there were too many persons mentioned, each gave very little information to make any of them my case. So let's create our own. Say we have a child named Helen who has 2 deaf parents. We will say she's just starting school, so age-wise around 5 or 6 years old. Her teacher worries that Helen is having trouble keeping up with her class during discussions and class presentations, but she succeeds in the written work. During all of her presentations, Helen finds herself speaking English, but also signing. Helen also seems to lack social skills that a typical 5 or 6-year-old should have. At home, Helen only has a younger brother who hasn't started talking yet. He is also a hearing child, so she is the only one in her family who actually speaks English, therefore she feels it is unnecessary to speak at home. Her parents do not ask her to practice speech either, and at home she will only communicate in American Sign Language with her parents and no communication with her little brother. During church services on Sunday, Helen and her family sit in the deaf section where there are no speakers there, but instead a signer signs for the group. Her parents try to get Helen to hang out with the other children during the after-church social, but Helen will instead sit in the corner. She will just watch her parents and the other deaf church members in silence. Once a year, Helen and her family travel to her uncle's house where she hangs out with her 3 cousins, one of which is also deaf. She will talk to him both in American Sign Language and in English during the whole time. She will also be asked to sign for her parents from her relatives who do not know American Sign Language. Helen tends to get upset with a constant translation for her parents. Helen feels the closest with one of her cousins, Steve, for his dad is also deaf. He is the only one where Helen can talk about her feelings about having deaf parents. They communicate in both American Sign Language and in English. Steve's speech is much more advanced than Helen's. This gives Helen a chance to practice what little speech she has. Helen also has some friends in her neighborhood, though she does not hang out with them a lot. Helen feels that she is needed at home in case her parents don't notice her brother crying. Her friends in the neighborhood find that Helen knowing American Sign Language is different and weird, so they don't talk about that a lot, leaving Helen feeling left out most of the time. Now let's place Helen in Bronfenbrenner's model of ecological perspective. Helen is living in the middle of a hearing and a deaf world. Her microsystem is complex with the deaf world and the hearing world not interacting well at all. At home, she is only communicating in American Sign Language due to she feels it is unnecessary to speak. This is causing great delays in her speech, for she has not had enough time to practice much language before school. The only real time she's had to practice was once a year with her older cousin Steve. These conversations, though, are not enough to help her speech out. Since her speech is greatly delayed, at school she feels left out and afraid to participate in class discussions. Left unchecked, this can lead to many self-esteem issues as Helen grows up. This can also lead to speech problems down the road. While at her church, though, Helen feels it is unsafe to leave the deaf community to join the other children her age. This shows that Helen does not feel a part of the other half of her life. This can lead to an identity crisis in life, but can also have a positive influence. Helen might feel extremely welcomed in the deaf community, where she has many different career paths open for her. Her Muslim system, though, is a little messy. Her home and church life are rather similar, with it having the same people, but her school life is another world completely. At school, Helen gets the impression that her home life is unwelcome because she's asked to speak English instead of signing. Her neighborhood friends and classmates find her knowledge of the American Sign Language weird and give and gives Helen the feeling that her family is different and strange. This makes Helen feel different than the other children and causes Helen to be embarrassed about her family, causing the atypical social interactiveness. In her ecosystem, she sees her parents hanging out with the deaf community members at her church and around her house. With her view from the hearing community from her school and neighborhood, Helen worries about how the other people will view her and her family. This view of how the hearing community looks onto the deaf community can cause several negative outcomes. One being, instead of doing well for the deaf community, Helen backs away from the deaf community and her family. Since Helen lives in between both the hearing and the deaf, she understands how each of them view the other. At this age, she doesn't see much, but as she grows, Helen will understand more and will either be proud to know how to sign or abandon the deaf community. Sadly, though, Helen's macro system has little to none of the deaf community, for her neighborhood and country is mostly of the hearing. Due to her young age, it is difficult to say if this will be a positive influence or a negative one. As of now, it is noticeable that Helen has speech delays and does not have the social skills that a typical 5 or 6-year-old would have. Helen's school can help with this by having Helen go to speech therapy to catch up on her language delay. Sadly, though, since Helen's parents do not speak with her at home, it will take a long time before Helen can actually catch up with her classmates on speech. Once her speech is improved, her confidence will grow and she'll be able to make more friends. On the issue that Helen has or will have about her family and the deaf community, it will take time to see if Helen chooses to make these a positive or negative impacts. At her age, it is difficult to tell what will happen. All that we know right now is Helen will need a better connection of the deaf and the hearing communities, and her mesosystem needs a more safe connection from her home and her school life. Her teachers need to meet up with her parents to set a plan where Helen has to speak English at home more and where Helen is allowed to sign during school. This will help Helen understand that the deaf community is welcome and her speech will improve over time. This is calling great delays in her speech blah 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 blah. I'm also starting to get a bit more confident.
Yeah, you are.
Please tell me you're recording that. I kind of want to see.
Yeah.